Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Evo Eco seminar. Before I introduce today's speaker, some housekeeping. So as you might all know by now, our Q&A session will be held through Slack, so you can please join our Slack page. If you want to ask questions, that will be at the end of this the hour. And I also want to briefly show our full schedule that we just announced. So we have announced talks for February and March, and next week will be Walter Salzberger, who I'm sure is going to talk about radiation of cichlids. And he recently had some amazing papers out, so I think it will be a very interesting talk. But today we'll have Gerald Carter giving a talk, and Jerry did his PhD at the University of Maryland with Jerry Wilkinson. He then did a series of postdocs at the University of Toronto, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior in Radolfzell. And Jerry has spent his career studying the behavior of various bat species, including great work on, for example, the call behavior. But he's perhaps best known for his papers on the enigmatic food sharing behavior in vampire bats. And this system was made famous in the 1980s by Jerry Wilkinson, who showed that the bats followed the rule of reciprocity, also among non-kin. And Gary has been hard at work expanding those results with both field studies and lab experiments, and he will share some of his results with us today. And with that, the stream is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I love this series of online talks. They're really useful. I use them in my own teaching. So if you're watching this talk, you're probably interested in the evolution of cooperation and conflict like me. And it's a really common question to ask. Why does some organism have some cooperative trait? People have been asking this question for decades. And it's important to note that cooperation occurs along a spectrum of social environments with different kinds of social complexity. Now, not surprisingly, the kinds of cooperative traits that you have depend on the kind of society you're born into. So if you were a female worker ant or a naked mole rat, you would have these altruistic traits. You would sacrifice your life for your colony. Your colony is your family, and there's a division of labor with helpers and breeders. And your inclusive fitness is tightly linked to group performance. So in this paper by Lucas and Cluttenbrock, which I quite like, they call this organizational social complexity. And most work on cooperation tries to understand these kinds of societies. But if you're a primate, you don't do that kind of extreme altruism. Humans are not as altruistic as bees. Baboon society is not as efficient and coordinated as ant society. Primate relationships are complex in a completely different way. So some individuals in your social network are kin, most probably not. And within the same group, you can have a close friend, an associate, an ally, a rival, maybe a bully. Every relationship is different. Every individual might have a different social rank. To navigate this kind of social world, you groom each other strategically. You try to change your relationships over time. Lucas and Cluttenbrock call this relational social complexity. And this might also exist outside of primates, like you see evidence for this in, say, cetaceans and corvids. I hope to convince you that also vampire bats are an example of this. And I think we understand cooperation in eusocial insects much better than primates. I hope I'm not offending anyone if I say that, but eusocial insects are much more tractable. They're easier to manipulate than, say, chimpanzees. So we understand a lot about what's going on with eusocial insect cooperation. We see that kinship is important because eusociality only evolved in lineages with lifetime monogamy, but relatedness isn't everything. So cooperation is also stable because of competition between colonies. And the reproductive altruism within a colony is actually enforced in many eusocial insects. So these here, I think you can see my cursor, right? So these here are workers punishing a worker that tried to lay her own eggs. And these ants are clonal, so there's very little genetic conflict. And here we see worker policing in bees. And this plot here shows that worker policing can suppress selfish reproduction, but surprisingly, higher relatedness is actually correlated with more of this sort of selfish, cheating reproduction within the colony. So it's clear that cooperative societies can be stabilized by multiple factors working together, and that enforcement can be important even among kin. So what about these so-called social bonds that we see in primates like chimpanzees? Is cooperation enforced by behaviors like conditional grooming and partner switching? Are there strategic investments, or are social bonds simple and easy, and do they just sort of emerge? I think it depends on who you ask. And it's been this common debate about whether cooperation in these long-term relationships is actively enforced by reciprocity or whether it's already stable on its own. It's often called pseudo-reciprocity. So in this case, it's an investment, but it's such a safe investment that you don't need to monitor or enforce anything. And there's quite a lot of debate about this, but I think it's actually kind of a false dichotomy. And I think the best argument for this comes from this 2016 review paper by Bashiri and others in Philosophical Transactions. So if you haven't read this paper and you're interested in this topic, I suggest that it's pretty interesting. And I think a better way to think about this is a continuous spectrum. So on one end, you have the infamous prisoner's dilemma. Cooperation must be enforced because a bad partner can make you even worse off than if you never met this individual. And so to ensure good returns, you have to reward good partners or switch away from them. And that's reciprocity in the broad sense. Now, on the other end, you have individuals whose fitness is inherently correlated for some other reason besides the response of the partner. And so there might be very little conflict here, maybe even maybe the conflict is basically insignificant. And Bashiri and others, they argue that most cases of cooperation nature are going to be in this middle area. And I think this is important to keep in mind. And what you see is that people who think reciprocity is really important, or people who think it's not important, tend to define it based on the gain payoff matrices down here. They define it based on the assumption that there's this maximal conflict. And people who think that reciprocity is really important tend to define it more based on, okay, well, if it's conditional, that's what reciprocity is. And so that allows reciprocity to also exist in this middle ground. And so I think this is also why it's useful to think about a spectrum, because we don't get stuck worrying about how to categorize things. And an important point I want to make here is that relationships might even move along this spectrum back and forth over time. You might have a relationship that starts with a lot of potential conflict, and then this potential conflict decreases as you have increasing fitness interdependence. So I'm going to talk about food sharing relationships in vampire bats, which have long been a textbook example of reciprocal altruism or reciprocity. And what I want to argue is that I actually think they're a better example of how cooperative relationships can be stabilized by multiple kinds of behaviors. So you have, for instance, you could have nepotism and reciprocity coexisting. You could have reciprocity between relatives, for instance. And that cooperative traits that evolve for one reason might be co-opted for another reason. So one reason to study vampire bats is simply because they're small. They weigh about 40 grams. And most of the drama of vampire bats' social life occurs in these small spaces, no bigger than a closet. So in the wild, they roost in hollow trees or in caves or even in tight crevices in bridges or in other buildings or in other structures that are made by people. And these are spaces that we can simulate in captivity, and we can see that they quickly habituate to captivity, and they do a lot of the same behaviors that we see in a wild roost. Now, adult vampire bats feed only on blood. And this is one feeding on the foot of a chicken. They get one meal a night. If they miss 2 nights, they're pretty weak. If they miss 3 nights, they can die. But they have this social safety net. Unfed bats can come back to the roost and receive regurgitations of blood meals from their close associates. And these are often kin, but not always. And these donations are important in nature because adults miss a meal about every couple of weeks, and younger bats actually miss a meal every few days. Now, what's nice about these is we can induce these in the lab by simply fasting a bat for a night. We basically deny it for food, and then we put it back into the cage, and we see who feeds it. And we call that a fasting trial. And we can measure the food donations as the time of mouth licking here. And then that actually correlates with the weight that the bat gains. So we know that they're getting food that's correlated with the time. Now, donors initiate most of these donations, and they will even go down to the ground to help a trapped conspecific by feeding it through the cage bars. So this is not based on harassment. They can recognize each other using these contact calls, and females are attracted to the calls of non-kin that feed them, but not to the calls of kin that don't feed them. So over the last 10 years, we've done almost 1,200 fasting trials from 5 different captive colonies in places like Trinidad. There's 2 in the US, 2 in Panama, over 100 bats. And the whole point of these studies is to try to understand why they share food. But we're also learning a lot of other things about the social lives of vampire bats. So this seems like a simple question. Why do they share food? Is it indirect fitness benefits? Is it kin selection? Is it reciprocity in the form of conditional helping or partner switching? Is it fitness interdependence? Is it all of these things? And I'll just kind of do a spoiler alert here, because I'll just tell you what I think right now. I think it's actually all of these things, and I'd like to show you the evidence for each one. Okay, I think it's almost certainly true that kin selection is playing an important role and that they're getting indirect fitness benefits. And everything I'm about to show you is also consistent with this idea of reciprocity, but I don't feel that we've completely proved it yet. If you're an absolute reciprocity skeptic, I think there's still room for being skeptical, but we're working on this. And the other idea of interdependence, it makes a lot of sense, but it's very hard to test, and I'll discuss that as well. So the first thing to know about food sharing is that it's almost certainly co-opted from maternal care. So female vampire bats have this extreme maternal care for a bat. They have 1 pup a year. The gestation period for this pup is about 7 months, which is really long for a bat. Nursing continues for 10 months. That's more than 3 times longer than other neotropical bats. They carry this infant that can be half their mass, and they balance this slow reproduction with a really long lifespan. So there's records of 17 years in the wild and basically 30 years in captivity, 29 and a half years in captivity. And as far as I know, all females regurgitate food to feed their pups. And this continues when those pups grow up. Now, males disperse after their first year, between 12 and 18 months, but females tend to be philopatric, and the mothers keep feeding them, and eventually their daughters start reciprocating. So I've seen a daughter as young as 4 months old drink blood on her own and then regurgitate food to her fasted mother. So her mother, who I experimentally fasted and put back. And you have to remember, this daughter is still nursing, but she'll feed her mother food that she got. And this must be the only mammal where this kind of thing is even possible. Just imagine a toddler is foraging for you and providing you with your food. So it's an interesting system in that regard. And this food sharing is extended to other family members. Females also feed other kin, their half-sisters, granddaughters, and they also feed non-kin. And all these relationships tend to be symmetrical, so sort of 2-way feeding. You also see these weak 1-way sharing relationships, and it's not clear if these are actually 1-way relationships or if they're just undersampled. And then no female feeds every bat in her group. So that's an important thing. Now, many people are surprised to hear that 95% of food sharing occurs with close kin. So 78% of it is just maternal care, 16% of it is with other kin, and there's only this 5% that's going to non-kin. This is if you just go out and look at what's going on in the wild. And at this point, it makes a lot of sense to ask, is this just kin selection? And I hope to show you that the answer is no, and I'll explain why. So the first line of evidence that this isn't just kin selection is that after you control for kinship, you find that co-roosting predicts food sharing. And in fact, the estimated effect of co-roosting association is higher than the kinship effect. And this is because the bats are switching between different roosts, and certain individuals will switch into the same roost more often than other individuals. And this is work that Jerry Wilkinson had done in the 1970s and 80s. And it's important to know here that most bats in the network are not close kin. So mean kinship is 0.08 with a high variance because there's matrilineage. So it's not family groups. And in fact, they don't live in stable groups at all because the roosting group composition changes almost every day because the individuals are switching roosts. And when they live inside of one tree or one cave, what we've noticed is that they're switching around inside of that larger roost. So what if we control for roosting association? And you can do this if you put bats in captivity for years. So everyone is familiar, and then you can fast the bats repeatedly over time, and you can make a food sharing network like this one. So this is 4 years of data based on over 1,300 observations. The red nodes are the females, the blue nodes are the males. And the size of the node shows how many recipients a bat fed. And the width of the gray arrow here shows the donation rate from one bat to another. And the mean kinship of this captive group is exactly what you expect to see in a wild colony. There's a mix of kin and non-kin, and there's multiple natural lines of kin. And you can see here that females preferentially form bonds with other females, which is also what we see in the wild. Most of the food sharing is among females. The best predictor of how much bat A feeds bat B is how much bat B feeds bat A. And that is more important than kinship, depending on how the difference between reciprocity and kinship depends on how exactly you do the analysis, whether or not you include grooming, for instance. But one problem here is that reciprocity among kin just looks like nepotism, okay? Because when we're talking about correlational evidence of reciprocity, we're actually talking about symmetry. So reciprocity is really the causal aspect. It's not just the fact that two individuals share food with each other, because you also expect that with kinship. So kinship bias is the correlational evidence for nepotism. And so evidence of nepotism and reciprocity are confounded if we imagine that animals are doing both at the same time. So can we actually detect, say, reciprocity among kin using observational data? And I think the answer is not really. You can't really do it because they're just confounded. So what you could try to do is make a model like this where you have the donation rate, which you're trying to explain with kinship, and say the reciprocal donation rate going in the other direction. And the standard way to do this, if you're doing a social network analysis, is something called multiple regression quadratic assignment procedure with double semi-partialing, which allows you to, it's basically a node label permutation test that is a version of multiple regression, but with data and matrices. And what's interesting here is if you just do this kind of analysis, you see that if you test both in the same model, you'll see that kinship bias is detected much easier, much faster, even when it's actually weaker. So here on the left, we have the effects of sampling effort on the x-axis, and on the y, you see the standardized regression coefficients for kinship bias and symmetry. Now this shading, the brown and blue, that's the 95% range of estimates with resampling. And what you can see is that the relationship between kinship and food sharing, this dotted line, it stabilizes after about 150 trial donations. On the other hand, the relationship between food given and received is still increasing even after we ran out of trial donations. This is all the data that we had. So, and the other thing is that it's the same is true for detecting an effect. Okay, so here we can see that the kinship coefficients in brown are significantly different than 0 after about 50 trials, and the symmetry coefficient is not detected until almost 200 trials. And for rare events, like one bat sharing food with another, it becomes really difficult to really get at these patterns. So for instance, in the original field observations, Jerry Wilkinson spent years watching these bats, and he only saw food sharing among adults like 21 times. And so really what's helpful here is to actually induce food sharing so we can get more data. Again, by the very end, after we compiled all the data, we can see that reciprocal sharing is actually, the estimate is a little more predictive than kinship, but you need a lot more data to see that there's symmetry and it's not just nepotism, because of this fact that nepotism is also symmetrical. And you can see the same thing in other species. So for instance, this is a plot, the same kind of plot for grooming in mandrills and in Japanese macaques. And in mandrills, you can see that symmetry here in blue is eventually shown to be more important, but kinship in brown is actually detected earlier with a smaller sample size. And in macaques, nepotism is clearly stronger than symmetry. However, both things are having an effect, and symmetry requires over 400 observations, whereas nepotism is immediately apparent. And the easiest way to see this is with simulated data. So with simulated data, you know the true relationship. So here, we can just simulate a situation where we know these relationships are completely symmetrical and reciprocal based on a sort of symmetrical social history, but we could also make them partially nepotistic. And under these sorts of conditions, if there's high enough nepotism, even if it's just partial nepotism, it can completely mask the effect of symmetry. So the take-home message is you can't actually disentangle these with observational studies, with the kind of social network studies that we do when we just go and watch animals. You need controlled experiments, and you need to have many, many helping events. Now, alternatively, you can focus on situations without nepotism, which is what we've mostly been doing. So for instance, like what happens when a female bat joins a new group And she's now unrelated to everyone. So we know this happens in nature. A group recruits a new female about every couple of years. And what happens in that situation? How does she form new relationships? How did two unrelated strangers develop a new food sharing relationship? So there's no nepotism in this case. So one important strategy based on the logic of reciprocity is called raising the stakes or testing the waters. And this equates to making a small cooperative investment at first, and then gradually increasing that investment in partners that provide good returns. It's a way of reducing risk. And this has been demonstrated this works in simulations, and also humans playing economic style cooperation games will also do this. But what would it look like in animals, in nature? One form it could take is if you imagine that vampire bats are building relationships, they might transition from low cost to higher cost and riskier cooperative behavior. So first they might test tolerance with a stranger, maybe just by approaching or maybe even calling first, clustering. Then they might try grooming, and if that is reciprocated, they might groom more. And then eventually this might lead into a food sharing relationship. So I haven't talked about grooming yet in vampire bats. This is what it looks like. So this is a bat grooming itself, and a bat that's grooming itself is actually several times more likely to be groomed by another bat nearby. A bat receives more grooming if you attach something to it, like these bat bands that we put on their wings, or if you mess up its fur, it'll be groomed more by other bats. And this is independent of how many ectoparasites they have. So they continue to do grooming even when they don't have parasites in captivity. And vampire bats also groom each other more than any other bat, to my knowledge. Here are grooming rates in vampire bats compared to other bat species housed in the same conditions. Female vampire bats spend about 5% of their active time grooming each other, regardless of whether they're in the lab or in the field. And males do it less, but they still do it more than other species of bats. And so what we tested for is whether reciprocal grooming rates increase before food sharing begins, something like this, a ramping up of grooming, and then we start seeing food sharing. And so we have to start with strangers. So to get strangers, we captured bats from sites hundreds of kilometers apart in Panama. So we know these bats are unrelated and they don't know each other. And we introduced them in captivity. So here's a stranger being introduced to 3 bats that are familiar with each other. And first, to ensure that they're all familiar, we kept the bats in separate groups. Then we did these controlled introductions in these smaller cages where we put them together as isolated pairs or as quartets. And we did 106 fasting trials during this time. Then we mashed both groups together. We did 532 more fasting trials over 300 days. And during this time, several bats were actually born into the group, so we can look at those as well. And this is the accumulation of first donations. So over 10 months, 15% of the adult female strangers that were at least previously strangers formed food sharing bonds. And most of the new pairs were grooming each other by the end of this period. And one prediction we made is that bats and isolated pairs would bond faster. So here on the x-axis, this is the type of introduction. On the y-axis is the new food sharing rate. And so we made this prediction that isolated pairs are going to form food sharing relationships faster. And you might call this prediction sort of like the college roommate effect. Now, if bats only based grooming and food sharing on their phenotypic similarity rather than their social experiences with each other, we would actually make the opposite prediction because there's more opportunities for matches in a larger group. But this is actually what we saw. So isolated pairs did start sharing faster. Another pattern that we predicted is this pattern here. So time is on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the probability of A grooming B, or the rate of A grooming B over time. And if B later fed A, we expected these dyads, these pairs, the grooming rate to be increasing. And it should be increasing more than in the pairs where the food sharing relationship never formed. So B never fed A. And this is, in fact, what we saw. So the grooming dynamics before food sharing began predicted food sharing. And there should also be a difference before and after food sharing. So this increase should only happen before food sharing relationships are sort of cemented. So if you create a day 0 for each successful food sharing relationship, you should see grooming ramping up before that, but not afterwards. And this is also what we saw. the pattern of grooming rates increasing up until food sharing begins, but not afterwards. And the most important prediction, of course, is that we expect these new relationships to emerge in a reciprocal pattern. So A's first donation to B should make it more likely that B is now for the first time going to help A. And also we saw this pattern as well. So all these bats are unrelated except for the captive bats. But if we include kinship there, we don't see any evidence for kinship bias in captive bats. So it could, we don't know how they discriminate kin. It might be based on who you grew up with. It might be based on prior association, or it might be based on some kind of phenotype matching. So we're interested in looking at this, but yeah, the relationships emerged reciprocally. So take-home message here, vampire bats appear to build up new food-sharing relationships by testing the waters via grooming. And non-kin relationships cannot be explained as a byproduct of kin selection or just based on phenotypic similarity, and they bond faster when they're isolated with fewer bats. I think this idea of raising the stakes might be more common than we think, and I think the way to look at this is to really look at strangers, which is why we don't have much evidence for it. It's very difficult to look at cooperation emerging between strangers in nature or under natural situations. And it's also important, I think, to also think about different kinds of behaviors that might vary in cost rather than just focusing in on one kind of investment. So a question here that arises is, why do bats form non-kin bonds when they already have kin bonds? Okay, so if there's reciprocity going on here, and if we think that maybe reciprocity is even happening with kin, why not just reciprocate with kin? And one possibility is that having more non-kin bonds is just better, or there might be some kind of trade-off between partner quantity and quality. And if it makes sense to me to think that if you have a strong reciprocal relationship with kin, that relationship should be more valuable per partner than one with non-kin, because you get the inclusive fitness benefits of helping a relative. Now, females do vary in how many non-kin partners they feed. So here are 15 bats, 15 females, and their probability of helping a bat that is not their mother or their offspring. And we can see these are the bootstrap 95% confidence intervals, and you can see there's a lot of variation. And here are those same females and how many non-kin they fed over several years. And what's interesting is to also look at how many close kin they have. So if they have close maternal kin, they're usually sharing food in both directions. But the red bars here, this is their family network that they're born into. And the blue bars is the kind of support network that they have the ability to create, or so we think. And so one hypothesis here is called social bed hedging, which is the idea that bats invest in non-kin to diversify their investments beyond their limited family. And if the social environment is really unpredictable, you don't know who's going to be around you on any given day, or bats might disappear when you need them, then you might do this even if kin relationships yield higher returns per capita. The idea here is that you don't want to put all of your cooperative investment eggs in one basket, so to speak. So we looked at each female's success at being fed under two conditions. In the treatment condition, we removed a key donor. And this was, if there was a mother-daughter in the group, then we use the mother-daughter because that's always the strongest relationship. In the baseline condition, we prevented sharing from a non-donor that never fed the subject in the last 4 years. So this is like, shouldn't really matter to this bat. So how well do they cope with this? And does it depend on how many non-kin they feed? So I'll show the results here. On the y-axis, we have average food received during the trial. And on the x-axis, we have the number of non-kin females fed over the past 4 years, controlling for opportunity. And first, I'll show the response when we remove a non-donor. And then I'll show when we remove a key donor. So under normal circumstances, females that help more non-kin in the past don't receive more food. So we don't see any evidence that individuals who are helping more non-kin are doing better. But when we remove their key donor, then suddenly we do see some evidence for this. Females that helped more non-kin did receive more food. And so in other words, bats with fewer non-kin bonds are suffering major losses when a key donor is removed, but bats that invest in non-kin, in having more of these non-kin bonds, coped well with the loss of a key donor because they had more donors, because they fed more bats in previous years. So these weak non-kin bonds do appear to provide this benefit, but it's sort of a cryptic benefit that's not obvious at first. And so the take home here is that weak non-kin bonds can provide these backup donors for when primary, say, kin donors go missing. And it's also important to note that females are investing in specific relationships, not in the whole group. This isn't a sort of group augmentation situation. There's evidence for these trade-offs between cooperative relationship, quality, and quantity within the individual in rhesus macaques and in lance-tailed manakins. And there's also evidence from other social animals that individuals try to replace relationships that are lost. So we see this in baboons and also in great tits. And what I like about social bet hedging is that it's an example of how an individual's decisions can shape its social networks, can shape its place in its social network or the structure of the social network. And often we're thinking in the other direction. So we have a lot of evidence that networks have important consequences for individuals. So network centrality affects your health, reproduction, survival, and this is true across a range of taxa. But what I'm particularly interested in is this feedback in the other direction where individual decisions or biases can feedback and shape network structure. So what explains these messy networks that we like to plot and try to make sense out of? And you can imagine several different things that could be happening. So when animals are born, they might inherit ties from their parents. That would be one example. If a parent dies, an offspring might associate with that parent's relationships. Okay, so this is sort of the opposite of social. And so you can have social inheritance of network ties, and then you can have sort of this what's called second degree rewiring, which is sort of the same thing happening in reverse. And the individuals might have these simple heuristics or strategies about when to form new ties, when to strengthen existing ties, when to switch from one partner to another. And social bet hedging is one such hypothesis of how this might happen. So what about social inheritance of new relationships in vampire bats? Do we see this? So I don't have an analysis of this, but I do want to just raise this one interesting case study, which is about non-kin adoption. So do vampire bats inherit their mother's bonds? Do indirect ties predict rewiring after death? There's this case study where existing relationships help to explain a case of non-kin adoption. This was observed by my graduate student, Imran Razik, and he just published this today, actually. So here's what happened. Two unrelated adult females, which he named BD and Lilith, they met in captivity. He introduced them. They're totally unfamiliar to each other. And then eventually he watched every day. They started grooming and sharing food. BD became Lilith's top groomer and food donor. So they were each more bonded to each other than to other bats in the group. Why? We have no idea why these two females just had this special relationship. Now, Lilith got sick and died, which was super sad for Imran. But then he noticed that BD adopted her orphan pup, and she actually then began lactating. Even though she didn't have her own pup, she began lactating and fed this pup. And this has actually been seen back in the 1970s in Germany. And I actually just kind of thought it was a myth that this happens, but we saw this. And BD did not attend to other pups. No other females helped this orphan pup. So I think this adoption is probably a non-adaptive byproduct of just extreme maternal care. But what's interesting is it was predictable from the social history because Imran had watched the entire colony and scored these behaviors every day for months. And one could imagine that it's somehow adaptive for females to adopt non-kin pups. It's just that we don't have any evidence for that. And there's no evidence, for instance, that they preferentially adopt females over males, which would make sense since males are leaving the colony. But I also think this is an illustrative case study of how an extreme helping behavior can be co-opted from traits that clearly evolved for maternal care. So let's get back to talking about explanations for food sharing. To see if bats do reciprocity, we still need the tests of partner choice and partner switching. And that work has been delayed because of the pandemic, but hopefully we'll get to it. And what I do want to talk about is fitness interdependence. Now, how do you measure this? I have no idea how to actually measure this or test this, but what we can do is measure other things that are related to interdependence, such as the scale of competition. How often do females compete for food with bats that are in their food sharing network versus bats that are completely unfamiliar to them? And we're getting insights into this from studies we're doing on social foraging. So we've been analyzing data on social foraging in vampire bats very recently, and I haven't published this yet. And this is following up on work we did on tracking relationships from the lab to the field. So to do this, we use these proximity loggers developed by this team of engineers, computer scientists, and field biologists. And we can glue these on the bats, and they log encounters with other tagged bats every 2 seconds. So it's amazing technology. And we can track their encounters, hour by hour, inside the roost, outside the roost. And what we did was, in one experiment, we tested if the relationships that we saw in captivity in the lab would persist in the wild. So we had them in captivity for 22 months. We saw that cooperation was increasing in captivity. They're basically in jail together. Then when we released them back, we saw, are these bats going to now be like a special group? And are they going to continue to hang out with the bats that they were grooming and sharing food with in the lab? So here we are, just releasing them back into the tree. And the basic story here is that the captive bats did reform their social networks when released back into the wild. And we could see this because we tagged an even larger group of control bats that were not in captivity together as a sort of comparison group, a control group. And we could see that the bats were clustering because the tags actually had different colors. And so we would peek inside the tree and we could actually see the captive bats were sticking to each other. And so we weren't entirely surprised when we looked at the network data and found that the previously captive bats did in fact roost closer together when they were in the wild, and they roosted closer with their previous food sharing partners and previous grooming partners. And you can see that assortment here in the network. These small nodes are the captive born females. They all left the site within 5 days, and they didn't integrate well with the wild colony, actually. We think maybe they're trying to home back to where they're born, but they also seem to have a lot of fights with the bats in the wild group. But here's the effect of food sharing, the correlation between food sharing, grooming, and kinship for these proximity networks based from these biologgers. And this is just showing the mean across all the days. Each of these data points is one correlation, one daily network. Okay, so the next challenge here is looking at how these relationships look across different contexts, especially foraging is what we're interested in. So we want to create the bat cow network. And this is, I think, where we'll begin to really understand how often these bats are competing or cooperating when they're foraging. So we do know that bats, let me change this sound here. We do know that bats will compete and fight over wounds. It's much easier to use an open wound than to make a new one by biting. And we know that bats will steal wounds from each other. This is a video by BBC. This is with expensive thermal cameras, and I think this is definitely in captivity. But you can see examples of bats both fighting but also feeding together. And this is some of our own footage. This is shot by Simon Ripperger, and he was just in the complete dark with infrared light filming these bats. And you see, again, skirmishes over wounds. You see bats that look like they might tolerate each other, other ones that are fighting over a wound or even maybe the whole animal. So we do see these antagonistic interactions as well as maybe sort of cooperative interactions. So see that, or at least bats that are tolerated. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at captive familiar female vampire bats, they don't seem to have a very clear dominance hierarchy. So master student Rachel Crisp, she watched 1,100 hours of footage and scored over 1,000 displacements of feeders where bats either pushed each other or one sort of chased another one away. And these plots show the probability that a bat of a higher rank wins against a bat that's this many ranks away. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the vampire bats. So what you expect to see if there's a real dominance hierarchy is what you see here in the female baboons and the long-tailed macaques, which is that the dominant individual almost always wins. And we don't see that with vampire bats. Instead, we see that the dominant structure is less linear than over 90% of like published data sets. So why might this be? One reason would be if vampire bats that are roosting together and sharing food and grooming aren't actually hunting together, so they never have this issue of like trying to decide who's going to get food. And this is consistent with what we're seeing. So these are foraging bouts of 50 vampire bats. Each row is a bat. And so this bat, for instance, left, this is just one day. This bat left the roost at 4 a.m. and came back a little before 5 a.m. And the bats below this line are the ones that were living in captivity together and then we released. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on in this plot. Like, so for instance, the huge difference between the control group and the bats are in captivity. But what's also obvious is that these bats are not departing together. They're not going out and hunting like one big flock of bats. Each vertical line is 30 minutes apart. And we don't see bats departing. We saw this across multiple days. We don't see bats all leaving together. So they're not hunting as a group. However, they do reunite with grooming and sharing partners for these brief encounters out when they're foraging. And so cooperative relationships do predict these foraging encounters across multiple days, even when you're controlling for the overlap in the foraging times. So foraging encounters are biased by social bonds in the roost and the associations in the roost, but they're not always together. And we don't think that they are, for instance, in foraging in the same way as a group of animals that are moving together as a group. And also, by the way, this bat here is not by scale. That is not how big a vampire bat is. Just in case those of you who haven't seen vampire bats. Okay, so most competition over wounds or prey might be with unfamiliar bats. And if this is true, then female bats might compete globally but cooperate locally. And this would be a source of fitness interdependence. This would be an example of how you'd have reduced competition between the bats that you're roosting with. So that's the best evidence we have for sort of fitness interdependence. Okay, so to wrap up, I think this is what is going on in terms of the evolution of food sharing in vampire bats. And this is just rampant speculation here. So I think food sharing is started as maternal care, originated as maternal care, but it's extended maternal care. Daughters are feeding mothers. Now, for equally related kin, all you need to do to have reciprocity is a bias where you prefer to feed bats that reciprocate more often. And we haven't tested this, but this seems to be consistent with what I'm seeing. So we still need to, we don't have enough kin dyads to really do these experiments yet, but hopefully this is something we can look at. But if this is the case, if there is a bias among kin, then this could also get extended to non-kin, because if you're preferring to feed bats that feed you more, that are when they're related, you could also extend this rule to non-kin. And once you're doing that, it might then benefit you to try to form completely new relationships if in fact having more of these relationships is beneficial. So I think there's this kind of process of co-option where behaviors are getting co-opted for other kinds of benefits. And I just want to end on this note talking about this concept of friendship. So there's this 1997 BBC documentary called Do Vampire Bats Have Friends? It was actually about animal cognition. And the vampire bats were just one small part of it. It was later renamed What Do Animals Think? Now, for most of my PhD, I didn't consider this a good question or a scientific question. And the real question for me has always been this one: do vampire bats switch away from partners that don't reciprocate? But it's been 10 years and we know a lot more about their social lives. We still don't know the answer to this question because we haven't done this experiment yet. It's a harder experiment than you might think to do. I think we will answer this, but I keep also coming back to this other question and wondering maybe this is actually a really interesting question. And what does it even mean? What does it mean to say that vampire bats are friends? So what is friendship? And in animals, we often define it based on preferred association. So animals that are highly affiliated. But it's obvious in humans, it's much more than that. It's more complex and involves social support and other things. And I think there are multiple drivers of cooperation among friends. So it's true that there's high fitness interdependence because you have the same stake in each other's success. There's alliances that form, maybe because of you have a common enemy. There's partner choice. There's threats of partner switching. All of this is very subtle, I think. I think there's subtle contingency, which people will deny if you ask them, but which is just undeniable if you think about how humans relate to each other. And I think reputation is important because there's reputation-based partner choice. And the importance of all of these things depends on what kinds of friends you are, how close you are. And so I've been trying to keep up on the literature on human friendship in anthropology. And so if any of you listening to this talk are interested in this topic, I'd love to get advice about certain studies that I may have missed, or just feel free to reach out to me. And I'm very interested in looking at evidence of these kinds of enforcement tactics within human friendships, particularly in tribal societies. Okay, and with that, there are way too many people that I can thank by name. So I've just put them all here, and I'm sort of out of time. And here are my funders as well. So I can take questions now, I believe.
Thanks so much. That was awesome. It's great to see all the new field results. They're really exciting. So, as we wait for some questions from the audience to come in, I have some questions as well. So, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about the sex differences. So, particularly, males seem to be involved a lot less in food sharing.
Yeah. So I actually don't know much about the males because I essentially stopped studying them after like the beginning of my PhD. And the main reason I did that is because I hypothesize, I'm not sure, but I think that when I would pull the males out to fast them and put them back in, it would increase the aggression between the males because they're setting up little territories and things. And also the males are not sharing food as much, and so there's a lot of like just wasted effort if they're not doing anything. So we haven't really looked at the males that much. But something I've always wondered about is if the males are not sharing food very much, we should expect to see much higher mortality in males. And Jared Wilkinson has talked about evidence for this in his data, but I've also seen data from Argentina where you don't actually see the kind of extreme mortality in males that you would expect if they are not sharing food. And so it's also possible that food sharing is largely about reproduction rather than survival. And that's something that, we haven't really looked at what the benefit is, whether it's more increases in reproductive success or increases in survival. I think the sort of default right now is to think that it's mainly about survival, but it could be female bias for that reason because of the huge investments that females make.
Yeah, because the non-kin sharing incentives should be the same between males and females, right?
Between males and females?
Yeah.
No, because females are forming these stable relationships with each other and not really with males. So the males are essentially just forming little territories. They don't seem to have particularly strong relationships with the females in their territories. They can't control the females' behavior. Females are actually bigger than males. They're just coming and going as they please. And the males are spending all their time chasing away other males and trying to monopolize on this territory. So yeah, different things going on there in terms of the social structure. It's mainly females that have these long-term relationships.
All right. You show rank can be relatively important for fights, but does the rank not affect food sharing? Also, is there any possibility that gut microbiome might affect food sharing?
Yeah, I've looked at both of those. I just didn't have time to talk about them. I don't see any relationship between what is going on at these feeders and food sharing in the familiar bats. And I think that that's the key, is within the familiar bats. So the bats that are in captivity, I don't see that they're like sharing food or grooming up a dominance hierarchy or down a dominance hierarchy. I don't see anything like that. I don't see any even correlation between the interactions at these feeders and what they're doing when they're like in the roost. And that could just be because the feeders are a situation where they don't even really have to compete because every bat could get food. It's just these sort of needlessly aggressive interactions that are occurring. Yeah, so I haven't seen effects of sort of interaction or effects of rank on food sharing. The other part of the question was about microbiome similarity. So we haven't published this yet. There's a PhD student, Karthik Yarlagadda at University of Illinois, and we just like last week just tested this, and there is a correlation between microbiome similarity and the bat social networks, but we don't know much beyond that. And that's what you would expect, given that they're licking each other all the time.
All right. Someone asked, I was wondering whether when the two strangers start to build up a new bond, what type of individual would start first? Is there any personality study of it? And when will bonds break up?
Yeah, so in terms of personality, like cooperativeness, that is actually what Imran is working on right now. He's just trying to look at variation between individuals, and if individuals are cooperative with, you could sort of do this because you can compare how how much grooming they extend to like the same panel of strangers. And there is a lot of individual variation. And in terms of what causes it, not sure, but we're looking at oxytocin and vasopressin receptors in the brains of vampire bats. So we have a number of brains that are right now at Cornell University, and there's a postdoc there named Angela Freeman, who's in Alex Ophir's lab. And she's looking at this. I'm very excited to see the results, to see if we can even see differences, neural differences between bats that are more or less cooperative with each other. What was the other part of the, I forgot the other part of the question, but there was something else.
What happens, when do they break up those the bonds? Or will they
Uh,
ever
we,
break up?
we don't know. We have a partner switching experiment, which is currently delayed because of the pandemic.
Uh, yeah, so related to your comment about the brains, so you're probably aware of this social brain hypothesis, right? And there's a lot of ideas about how social behavior should relate to cognition. And often the argument made is that keeping track of personal relationships is really important. And it seems like the vampire bats would be perfect system to study this in, right? So do you think vampire bats are smarter than other bats?
I'm pretty biased. I think they're really smart. Um, the name Desmodus rotundus, their scientific name, comes from, I think, some museum person might correct me here, but I think it comes from the fact that their skull is so domed. And they do have this very large brain, and people have used it as a data point in this idea of like brain size and social complexity. But I also understand that this is a very controversial thing. I don't really know enough about brains to have an opinion about it. I like the idea of it. Whether or not it's true, I don't know. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at. I mean, people have done a number of comparative studies with different with brain size and different parts of the brain in bats, because there is like a lot of data on, there's a sort of atlas for several species of bats. But to be honest, I don't know enough about brains to say anything intelligent about it.
Fair enough. Someone asks, would you expect the presence of reciprocity in food sharing to be related to the individual's fitness or condition?
It's complicated. I mean, just testing reciprocity is already complicated. And then trying to, I mean, I've never measured fitness in vampire bats because you need to have these like really long-term field studies to do that. And they also are not, there's not huge variance in reproductive success between females. But yeah, I could just go on and on about this, but yeah, I'll just say that I just trying to understand if to really show reciprocity itself is so much more difficult than I originally thought, just based on, so I'm not there yet. Just to briefly explain why it's difficult. So there's two times when you can try to manipulate the relationships: when they're weak, and therefore you might be able to really shift them around. Then you don't have very many food sharing events because they're weak relationships. So they might be easy to change, but they're hard to measure. And then the other situation is where the relationships are really strong. But then also those relationships by definition should be kind of hard to manipulate. And it's not clear how many defections should count. It's definitely not the case that after one defection, the vampire bats just completely change their relationships. So we want to look for these kind of gradual changes.
Do you ever do choice experiments where you give a donator the option to share with several individuals?
Yeah, we're doing that next. I've done things like that, but I've tended to have one fasted bat at a time. I haven't done a lot of experiments where I did one experiment where I fasted one whole group and then had another whole group, but it was fed, and I put them all together to see if the fasted bats would all be begging from the fed bat. So in other words, can a bat tell who can feed it and who can't? And that experiment was basically told me that they can tell eventually, but not immediately. They tried. You'll get two unfed bats that try to get food from each other, at least for a few, at least for a while, and then they realize that this isn't going to work.
All right. Do you have any information about whether females form stronger social bonds with their older daughters versus their younger daughters? And does this affect food sharing?
Um, I don't know. It would have to be within adults. I mean, the relationships are so different when they're young and because they're nursing and they're just attached to the mother. So obviously, depending on how you measure it, that's going to be stronger. But in terms of if a adult female has two adult daughters and one of them is older, I don't know. That's an interesting thing to look at, though.
How many individuals are usually involved in these social grooming events? Is it always one-on-one, or are there multiple individuals?
There can be multiple. There can be these like grooming chains where one bat's grooming another bat's grooming that. But it's usually dyadic, and it's usually a lot of it is they're grooming each other at the same time. And it's mostly, I would say, like pairs, but you do see like chains or pylons.
Do you think that matters when it's more than just two?
Don't know. I haven't thought about it that much. I haven't really thought about it much, like what the difference would be between those. One thing that I have looked at, which I didn't talk about, is that I think there's really two kinds of grooming. I think there's a grooming where a bat is grooming itself, and then for whatever reason, it's in a sort of grooming state, and then it just starts grooming bats around it as an extension of its grooming itself. And then there's cases where a bat is just hanging out, and then another bat's grooming itself, and then that bat responds to that bat's grooming by going over and grooming it. And I think that these are kind of like events that are driven either by the actor or by the recipient. And I think that they're different because I think an actor-driven grooming is not really helping another individual, whereas I think the other one is. And I think that these are really weird and difficult things to try to tease apart. And I also think about this with myself, like how my wife will come and like groom me. And sometimes I like it, but sometimes it's obviously just for her own amusement. And she's like picking through my hair or something when I have hair.
All right, maybe a final question then. You briefly alluded to trying to figure out what the kin recognition system is and how good they are at kin recognition. Do you have any future plans for that? Because it
Yeah,
seems very important, right?
we have this giant. Well, one thing I'm interested in particular is kin recognition by call. So we have this giant call library, and there's someone named Grace Smith-Vidar who has been helping me with this. Although she's now moved on and doing better things, but she's helped me a lot with this project. And we're gonna look for evidence for kinship signatures in the calls, and also for evidence for vocal learning, like vocal convergence between bats as they are bonding with each other. And that's all just work that is ready to be. This all data ready to be analyzed. We're just buried under analyses.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So briefly at the end, then I want to remind everyone that next week we have Walter Salzberger on the schedule. The title of his talk will be "The Dynamics of Adaptive Radiation in African Cichlid Fishes," which I'm sure will be very exciting. And I hope to see you all next week.